Okay, we're going to be looking at the reign of Asa this morning, and I'm probably not saying that right, but that's what I've grown up saying, so I'm probably going to keep saying Asa. I actually listened to it in Hebrew, and the correct pronunciation is probably Asa, but I can't bring myself to get in the habit of doing that, so you'll excuse me if I continue to call Asa. And we're probably going to look, well, not probably, we are going to look at Asa's dad, Abijah, some this morning also. Maybe I should have even put his name on the title slide also, because we are going to spend some time, because it's a nice contrast. We've been talking about the kings of Israel, and we've been spending quite a bit of time on Jeroboam, and then last week we talked about Omri, and we spent some time on some bad kings, and I thought it would be good to go back and catch up and spend some time talking about the kings of Judah. And as it happens, talking about Asa really does get us caught up. One of the things I want to do today as we come across the timeline is show you that Asa gets us all the way up to Ahab's reign, which is about where we left off when Omri dies, right? Because Asa reigns for 41 years, and all these initial kings of Israel are during Asa's reign. In fact, Asa overlaps with Jeroboam by 1 or 2 years, and then he goes all the way to King Ahab in Israel and overlaps with him several years. So we're just going to see that his reign, actually, if you look at the total, Ryan was talking about this the other night, that if you look at the total number of years that Israel as a nation was in existence, it was 209 years. If Asa is the king of Judah for 41 of those years, that's 20%. That's 20% of the entire existence of the nation of Israel. Asa is king of Judah during that time. If there's a theme to this morning's lesson, it's going to be to, you could probably pick out several things, but one of the themes that I want to pick out is our need here in the 21st century to study to show ourselves approved. Because unless you look at all the sources, both Kings and Chronicles, we might get the wrong idea about Abijah. We might get the wrong idea about Asa. And to get the complete picture, you really do need to look at all of these sources. And I'm going to point that out in several different ways as we go through the material this morning. Okay, we've been talking, we're in the period of time known, or that we refer to as the divided kingdom, United Kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon, the two kingdoms split, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam staying with the south with Judah, Jeroboam going to the north with the northern 10 tribes. So Jeroboam's up here, and Rehoboam's down here with Benjamin and Judah, the southern 2 tribes. And we've talked about Jeroboam setting the northern 10 tribes on just this terrible path that just led, this path that involved idolatry and wickedness, and it just set the tone for all the kings of Israel. They were all bad. They all followed Jeroboam's example, and they were all bad kings. So that's the northern 10 tribes. Now we're turning our attention back to the southern 2 tribes, and we're going to pick up Asa. Asa is the son of Abijah. Abijah was the son of Rehoboam. Rehoboam, of course, was the son of Solomon. So I want to start in 2 Chronicles chapter 13. Turn with me, if you will, to 2 Chronicles chapter 13. We're going to start talking about Asa's dad, Abijah. And I'm not going to turn to 1 Kings until after we're done looking at 2 Chronicles, and I'm doing that for a reason. I really want to bring out a couple of things here in 2 Chronicles chapter 13. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Mackey, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. Now there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Abijah began the battle with an army of valiant warriors, 400,000 chosen men, while Jeroboam drew up in battle formation against him with 800,000 chosen men who were valiant warriors. Okay, so Abijah becomes king. It tells us that there is going to be war between Abijah and Jeroboam, and in this pitched battle, Abijah shows up with half the men that Jeroboam does. So can somebody read verses 4 through 12 for me? Really want you to take note of this. This is Abijah, and I want you to pay attention to the speech that he makes in going into this battle with Israel and with Jeroboam. That's what verses 4 through 12 are. Somebody read 2 Chronicles 13, verses 4 through 12. Man, verse 12 there, the last verse that Nick read. Now behold, God is with us at our head, and his priests with the signal trumpets to sound the alarm against you, O sons of Israel. Do not fight against the Lord God of your fathers, for you will not succeed. I read this, and I'm thinking, Abijah might be in Hebrews the 11th chapter, the great chapter of men of faith, because look at his faith, and look how he's giving the glory and the credit to God. It's not that my 400,000 men are so much stronger than your 800,000 men. He says, we're still obeying God. You guys are worshiping idols. Do you think you're going to win this? God is with us. He really shows that, at least at this point in his life, that he has faith in God. Look at verse 15. Then the men of Judah raised a war cry, and when the men of Judah raised a war cry, then it was that God routed Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. Now, Jeroboam, it looks like he was a good general. It tells us there in verse 13 that he sent part of his men around behind Judah, and he was going to attack them from in front and ambush them from behind. And that's not bad generalship, but it doesn't matter. He's fighting against God. And in verse 15, because of their faith, verse 18 also, but we see that it says that God routed Israel before Abijah and Judah. Look at verse 18. Thus the sons of Israel were subdued at this time, and the sons of Judah conquered because they trusted in the Lord, the God of their fathers. If I was underlining, I would underline that. All because they trusted in the Lord their God. In fact, that's one of the lessons we should walk away with from talking about today. Always trust in God. You don't fail when you trust in God. Things may not work out the way we expect them to, the way we want them to in this life, but today, and 2023, if we trust in God, if we put our trust in God, ultimately, everything's going to work out. And I could lose my life, but if I trust in God, then am going to be blessed with eternal life through, not because I've earned it, but because of God's great mercy, the sacrifice that gives us hope. Trust in God. That's, if there's one lesson, I can close this today right now, close the book, and we can go to worship service. But trust God. Put him first. Abijah did here, and Abijam did here, and it looks like he might belong in Hebrews the 11th chapter. But it's not the whole story yet, is it? It goes on to tell us that Abijam becomes powerful in verse 21. In verse 21, but Abijam, I'm saying Abijam. 1 Kings calls him Abijam. 2 Chronicles calls him Abijah. Don't get hung up by that. They're the same person. Verse 21, but Abijah became powerful and took 14 wives to himself and became the father of 22 sons and 16 daughters. So Abijah becomes powerful. And then the account here in 2 Chronicles ends. Now the rest of the acts of Abijah and his ways, and the words are written in the treatise of the prophet Iddo in chapter 14, verse 1. So Abijah slept with his fathers. So that's what we learn from 2 Chronicles 13. Almost, and I'm going to say almost because I'm going to go back to this point later, but almost nothing negative said about Abijam here and in these verses that we've read in the 13th chapter. And again, I'm going to go back to that and revisit that in just a minute. But you read that rousing speech before they go into the battle, and you think, man, what a man of God. I mean, he's standing up there giving this inspiring speech. God hears him, blesses him, and God helps him rout Israel. And then I want you to consider this on the timeline. This is a really good timeline that Ryan's put together. If you don't have it, Ryan will email it to you. I use it a lot. But note that if we look at Abijam down here, he's got a minus sign. I don't know if you noticed this before, but Ryan has put this in here for us. The minus signs mean bad kings, and the plus signs mean good kings. And those aren't arbitrary. Those aren't just Ryan's kind of opinion. We can go to the scriptures to support that. We just haven't gone to the scriptures yet for Abijam and supported that, and that's what we're going to do right now. But there's kind of, universally, people make these charts and lists, and Abijam has a frowny face. See up there on the right under Judah, the second king, you got Rehoboam, and you got Abijam right after Rehoboam. He's got a frowny face. Yes?
I think this is a really good place to just kind of insert this reminder. Whenever we read through Kings and Chronicles, sometimes we think they're parallel, telling the same story, but they have different purposes. And I don't mean to say this in a disparaging way.
No.
I don't mean that at all. But Chronicles is David and temple propaganda.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you see this. Like, I'm not saying that Abijah didn't do some good stuff, but Chronicles wants you to know the good stuff about David and the temple.
Yeah.
And there's a good example of this stuff.
I think so too. And consequently, in conjunction with what you just said, Chronicles follows the kings of Judah a lot more than 1st and 2nd Kings does. You want to learn about the kings of Judah, we spend more time in Chronicles. We're going to see that with Asa as well. That's exactly right. Everybody hear that? Ryan says that, it's good to note, and this is a great point, that Chronicles comes from a certain perspective, and Kings comes from a certain perspective. They don't contradict each other. If we think they contradict each other, we have the problem. We just have to kind of work that out and figure out, okay, this seems like a contradiction. What's going on here? And ultimately, they don't contradict each other. But they're coming from different perspectives. Chronicles is trying to show the lineage of David and the things pertaining to the temple and follow that down, where Kings is coming from a different perspective. Kings is going to talk about a lot of the kings of Israel, and that's not so good. Yes, ma'am?
So where do you, not to get too much off track, but where do you find the justification for the frowny face?
That's where we're going to go to next.
Okay.
So that's the next slide. Okay, that's okay. Good question. I'm glad you're kind of going where it logically makes sense to go, and that's what we're going to do. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 15. Let's look at Abijam in 1 Kings chapter 15. We're going to be doing this a lot today, switching back and forth between the account in 1 Kings and the account in 2 Chronicles. In 1 Kings, switch pages in my notes here. 1 Kings chapter 15, right there at the beginning. Let's see. We see some of the same things we saw in Chronicles. Look at verse 1. Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijah became king over Judah. It says something very similar or the same thing over in Chronicles. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Mackey. Remember, I had problems with that name last time, so it says that over in Chronicles, the daughter of Absalom. And then look, though, at verse 3. We don't get verse 3 over in the Chronicles account, okay? Look at verse 3. This is 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 3. He walked in all the sins of his father, which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, like the heart of his father David. We don't get that verse over in Chronicles. And to Ryan's earlier point, there's a reason for that. That's not what they were wanting to emphasize in Chronicles. But 1 Kings gives us that information, and we believe both these books to be inspired. Okay, Jesus refers to these books, and interestingly, this is probably for another lesson sometime. You'd think that in the Hebrew Bible, you'd think that Chronicles would follow Kings. It doesn't. You have the book of the Kings, and then you have some books of the prophets, and Chronicles actually comes at the very end of the Hebrew Bible. And I think that Jesus kind of makes reference to that, in fact, too. But that's for another lesson. But verse 3, we just don't get in Chronicles. He walked in all the sins of his father, which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, like the heart of David his father. Now, there's only 7 verses here that deal with Abijah in 1 Kings 15, so we're just going to read them. Verse 4, but for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem to raise up the son after him and to establish Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. Now, the rest of the acts of Abijah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Verse 8, Abijah slept with his father. So we only have these 7 verses kind of dedicated to Abijah in 1 Kings 15. But I wanted to spend just a little bit of time to flesh this out a little bit more. What other evidence do we have, both from 1 Kings and from 2 Chronicles, that Abijah was a bad king? We know he's a bad king because it tells us he followed in the ways of his father. All the sins of his father, he did that. And he did not devote his whole heart to the Lord his God. We have that in verse 3. But there's other things that we can pick up on here. Back in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 21, I read this. He has 14 wives. Okay? He became powerful, and he took 14 wives. Remember what, we studied this or talked about this in a previous lesson also. Remember what Deuteronomy 17:17 says, and that's in the context in Deuteronomy that says, when you go in, you take over the land, sometime you're going to want yourself a king, and you're going to get a king. The king needs to do these things, and he needs to not do these things. And he's not to multiply a couple of things. What was he not to multiply? Wives and horses, that's right. Wives is one of them. Wives is Deuteronomy 17:17. Not to multiply wives. And here it says that Abijah took for himself 14 wives. And, again, unless we try to be disciplined Bible students, studying to show ourselves approved unto God, we might blast right past that in 2 Chronicles and not pause to think, the kings of Israel weren't supposed to do that. Deuteronomy 17:17. They weren't supposed to multiply wives. He allowed the idolatry of his mother to continue. Look at 2 Chronicles. Flip back over to 2 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 16. Now, I should make the point here that a lot of the reason that we know Abijah was a bad king is the messes that he left for Asa to clean up. When we get to Asa, we're going to see some reforms that Asa made. And in the context of those reforms, we scratch our heads and we go, Abijah, who made this great rousing speech, allowed this to continue? And the answer is yes. It looks like Abijah was steeped in idolatry. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 16. This is Asa now. Asa removed Mackey, the mother of King Asa, and we're going to talk about that mother business here in a minute. It's actually his grandmother, from the position of queen mother because she had made a horrid image as an Asheroth, and Asa cut down the horrid image, crushed it, and burned it at the brook of Kidron. We're going to talk about mother and grandmother and the Hebrew words here in just a minute. It's very interesting. But right now, accept that this is his grandma. And Abijah doesn't do anything about this. This is Abijah's mom. He just allowed this idolatry of his mom to continue. And that's not the only thing that he allowed to continue. Look in verse 12 of the same chapter. This says, go back to 1 Kings. 1 Kings 15 and verse 12. 1 Kings, you're going to have your thumb in one of these places. 1 Kings 15 and verse 12. Let's see. 15 and verse 12. I'm in 2 Kings. All right. 15 and verse 12. This is Asa again. He also put away the male cult prostitutes. Some of your translations will say sodomites from the land and removed all the idols which his fathers had made. This is talking about Asa again. The reforms that Asa instituted. He removed the sodomites or the male cult prostitutes from the land. And he removed the idols that his fathers made. Okay, who would his fathers be in this context? Well, it would be Abijah, Rehoboam, and maybe even Solomon. Okay, Solomon got caught up in idolatry there at the end also, right? So, but also he allowed male cult prostitutes to continue in the land. These are probably cult prostitutes to the shrines and the high places of the peoples of the land that Israel didn't utterly destroy like they were commanded to when they came in. Well, this was allowed to continue under Abijah. And Asa says, time to clean this up. So we kind of know how bad Abijah is by the messes that Asa cleans up. Turn to 1 Kings 14 and verse 22. Just a couple of pages back from where we just were. Look at 1 Kings 14 and verse 22. This is still talking about Rehoboam now, under the reign of Rehoboam. 14 and 22. Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy more than all their fathers had done with the sins which they committed. For they also built for themselves high places and sacred pillars and Asherim on every high hill and beneath every luxuriant tree. That's under the reign of Rehoboam. All right? Now, look at, chapter 15 and verse 3, again talking about Abijah, and again we mentioned this a minute ago. Abijah walked in all the sins of his father. So we see what his father was involved in. His father was involved in idolatry, setting up high places and Asheroth. And it says Abijah walked in all the sins of his father. Pretty good evidence that Abijah was involved in idolatry as well. And now look at chapter 15 and verse 12. Again, the last part of verse 12. He put away the male cult prostitutes from the land, and he removed all the idols which his fathers had made. So I think we could at least talk about Abijah being involved in idolatry and Rehoboam being involved in idolatry. I don't, we'd have to look at it to make a case for Solomon. I think I probably could too. But his fathers, Asa, put a stop to this. Okay, we're going to talk about Abijah in a minute. But pretty clearly, Abijah was involved in idolatry. And finally, in verse 3 of chapter 15, his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord God like the heart of David, his father. So again, if there's a theme that I could stress this morning, it's our need to look at all the evidence out there in studying an individual or whatever it is that we're studying. And you don't get the complete picture unless we read both Chronicles and Kings. We get a picture, but man, if we just read Chronicles, it's kind of like Ryan called it, Judah and temple propaganda. It's meant to bring out all the good things, but it doesn't bring out without doing a deeper study, we don't get the fact that, oh no, Abijah's a bad king. He did this. He allowed the male cult prostitutes to get. He continued in all the adultery of his fathers. He did all these things, and he gets the frowny face at the end of the day. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Trying to think about how to square these two pictures that are so different as you
Yeah.
were bringing out, and I don't know if this is the full thing or even right on, but it seems like in Chronicles we get Abijah's own view of himself and the people, and like it's kind of easy to pull out like, oh well, actually we're doing it right and we're worshiping the right way, and we sure are better than you in Israel, and that's kind of his standard is just kind of some of the exterior stuff and how they stack up to someone else. Then in Kings, God is looking at his heart, and he's looking more holistically at, are you actually fully devoted to me? And the answer is a clear no. And I think
Right.
maybe that it's kind of easy for us to either compare to someone else or look at the outside, or do we, can we say that we're checking a few boxes, but God's looking for a lot more than that?
Amen. And thank you for making that connection. That's a very good. And Adam made the practical application to us today. Are we like Abijah? Are we heading down the road thinking, hey, there was once 20 years ago where I stood up and I really made this great speech for the Lord, but God is looking at me and saying, yeah, but your heart is not wholly dedicated to me. That's a great point. It's a great point for us all to take away. Chad.
I was trying to reconcile that, like Adam, and that was helpful. Because I look at maybe it's a time factor, but he did conquer Jericho. He did. I guess what he was saying was a bit of hypocrisy. Is that how we should take his speech? Because he wasn't necessarily living that way. He was
Okay.
praying.
That's a good point, and I could probably spend a whole couple of Sunday mornings just kind of elaborating on the point that Chad just made. And here's this guy who makes this great speech, and yet it appears to be hypocrisy because we see some of these other bad things that he's involved in and doing, and his heart is not right before God. Yes, but I will say this, Chad, that isn't that realistic that gets back to Adam's point, at different times in our lives, we might rise to the occasion, and then that's all we focus on, that's all we think about, and we think, I'm right before God because a couple of years ago I told that guy, no, I'm not having a beer with you, or whatever. We think we're going to hang our hat on one, and yet God sees the complete picture. I mean, the complete picture. And is our heart truly right before Him? Have we devoted ourselves to Him? That was just one component. I mean, I get very realistic for looking at Rob Mackey. I need to look at myself in light of that, of your observation. Yes?
This is the way that I sort of reconcile it too, and it's a real thing. If you do best case scenario and give Abijah the benefit of the doubt, you could say, let's just say, he did love the Lord, and he did serve the Lord. But he also did other things too.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, and that's the thing that I think we can learn from this great example is that God does not share his throne.
Yeah.
And it's like, whether it's true about me or it's true about the world, I think that you could look at people in the world and say, yes, I think you really do love the Lord. You really do serve the Lord like Abijah is doing here. It's the but that's the problem. But also, that's the trouble.
Yeah, that's right. And we have this idea that we can serve God and mammon, but the New Testament kind of tells us you really can't do that, right? John 14 and verse 6, Jesus says, he that is not with me is against me. You're either with him or against him. He that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad. But the point is, Orion's point is exactly right. We can't fool God. We can fool ourselves, can't we? We can fool ourselves. We can think that, well, I can come to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night. Every time the doors are open, I'm here. But how do I live my life the rest of the time? What do I do the rest of the time? Linda.
Well, I was kind of thinking too that when we talked about David and the things that, he did that were wrong or were sinful, his heart was always repentant and turning back to God and trying to wholly serve him. And so
Right.
But God still describes him as a man after his own heart, where, maybe these things, they just were not repentant for them.
Yeah, it's a good point, Linda. And to bolster your point, I would look at verse 5 of our text right here, 1 Kings 15, because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. And Ryan talked about this verse a month ago or a couple of months ago, and the other instances where it says David, always did what was right before the Lord. But we know David had other sins besides murdering Uriah the Hittite and committing adultery with his wife. We know that he numbered the people. We know there were some other things that David did that he shouldn't have done. But Ryan really stresses, and I think it's a great way of looking at this, consistent with what Linda just said. One thing David never did was stop believing that God is the God, the creator of the universe, that he is the sole God. He is the Lord our God. And David never involved himself with idolatry. He never had other gods at the same time. And these men that we're looking at least Abijah unfavorably, he did. Yeah, to Ryan's point, he may have thought that, hey, I love God. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to stand up here and make this speech. But, when I get home, I'm going to go to the Ashtaroth and the Baals and I'm going to go to the high places. Saw a hand over here. Yes, Nick.
Yeah, this is sort of a point that I never really saw before, but I think it might be worth mentioning, which is David obviously was the first king, and his heart was right, he was repentant. He didn't sort of have the opportunity or the pressure like these other kings did to, quote-unquote, walk in the ways of their fathers. Like, I think it's important to note that these kings that come afterwards, while their heart might be right, they have generations and generations of idol worship and bad father figures sort of influencing them at the same time. And David didn't have that. He was a shepherd. He didn't grow up with idol worship all around him constantly.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. You would think that you would look at the history of your predecessors and go, oh, that's not working out so good for the kings of Israel, going down this path. But look over here at the kings of Judah, and it looks like God's with them. And you think at some point, Sir Walter Raleigh wrote A History of the World in 5 volumes. In the second volume, he is talking about the civil war that ensued between Tibni and Omri in the north. And right after he gets done talking about the civil war and kind of all the chaos that's going on in the north, Sir Walter Raleigh makes the point that, now how come these kings didn't just look over to Judah and see the reign of Asa and that everything's kind of going pretty good for Asa and go, you know what? This isn't working out. Let's subject ourselves to God again. Let's go back with Judah. And I think there's probably a number of reasons they didn't. But they had history that they could look to your point, and see how it was working out. God was with David. David put God first before any other, and he was God. There were no other gods. Lisa, I saw your hand up a minute ago.
I was thinking, one of the things that's so easy to forget is, Satan just runs all over the earth, to and fro, waiting to sink his teeth into the forearm of any one of us who are trying to live right, because that is much easier to do. Well,
No,
rephrase that. It's more rewarding for Satan because he knows he's allowed free reign like that now. And if he can pull any one of us down that might have done good or, whether we messed up later, and he has succeeded in ways that are more physical, is if I can say, well, I did these things, and then turn around and not want to add, I used to do these things.
Yeah.
Or a year ago I did those 2 things that I shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
And he's constantly having a victory, and it's sickening.
He's nipping at our heels, isn't he? He's like a roaring lion, Peter says. I love this discussion, and everybody's kind of looking at the 2 examples and trying to reconcile them and thinking, man, how could this happen? But at the end of the day, don't you think this is realistic? When you look at your own life, excuse me, when I look at Rob Mackey, I think it's very realistic. And I constantly trying to evaluate, reevaluate where I'm at in my spirituality before God. Do I just think I'm okay? but I haven't devoted my heart fully to him? That's really one of the lessons I should walk away with. Or am I giving in to Satan, as Lisa brought to our attention? Okay, I want to talk about Asa. He's the third king of Judah. He begins his reign in the 20th year of King Jeroboam. Asa did what was right in the side. That's supposed to be sight. Nice typo there. Asa did what was right in the sight of God. His heart was wholly devoted to God. 1 Kings 15 and verse 11. Look at verse 11. 1 Kings 15 and verse 11. Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. He also put away the male cult prostitutes from the land. So he makes all these reforms that are talked about. And we've already looked at them in verses 12 and 13. And then we're told in this account in Kings that he warred with the king of Israel, which at that time was Baasha. Look at verses 16 and 17. There was war between Asa and King Baasha, I'll say, king of Israel, all their days. Baasha, the king of Israel, went up against Judah and fortified Ramah in order to prevent anyone from going out or coming in to Asa, the king of Judah. Now, will somebody read for me verses 18 through 21? 1 Kings 15, 18 through 21.
And Asa took all the silver and gold that were left in the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and gave them into the hands of the servants. And King Asa sent them Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabrimon, the son of Hezion, king of Syria, who lived in Damascus, saying, "Let there be a covenant between me and you, and there was between my father and your father. Behold, I am sending to you a present of silver and gold. Go break your covenant with Baasha, king of Israel, that he may withdraw from me." And Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa and sent the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel, and conquered Abijah, Dan, Abel-Beth, Maacah, and all Chinneroth, with all the land of Naphtali. And when Baasha heard of it, he stopped building Ramah and lived in Tirzah.
Okay, good reading. Thank you very much. Sorry about the hard words in there. You did much better than I would have. But does anybody see a problem with this story? Yes, sir.
Why couldn't he have given a speech like his father did?
Yeah, and relied on God. And
Going with a treaty with this king of Syria.
we're going to talk more about that. But if you just look at what's said here, you might miss the point that Mark just made for us. This text tells us he's going to go to battle with King Baasha, king of Israel, and it says, he's a little worried about it, so he makes a strategic alliance with the king of Aram and says, hey, I'm sending you gold and stuff. Why don't you stop supporting King Baasha and side with me, and we'll take care of this. And King Aram said, oh, great, money, gold, silver, hey, okay. And King Aram does it. And you might be led at the end of the story to think that, oh, that was pretty strategic. That's pretty strategic of Asa to do that. And look, he's got this big risk board out in front of him, and he's playing risk, and he's being strategic, and it was a good deal. He beat Baasha, and Baasha, had to leave and go back to the capital city of Samaria, go back to Tirzah and take care of business up north. But we're going to learn from Chronicles that that's not the case, that this isn't a good thing, and Mark has already said why, because he should have trusted God. He should have stood up like his dad and made a rousing speech. In the end, Asa becomes diseased in his feet and dies, having reigned 41 years. That's in verses 23 and verse 24. So now turn to 2 Chronicles, and this is going to be, we're going to look at some verses in chapters 14 through 16. This is like, for any of you who are old enough to know who Paul Harvey is, this is kind of like Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story, right? 2 Chronicles 14. Okay, Asa in 2 Chronicles 14. Now, a lot of this is exactly like we just read and talked about in 1 Kings. Asa becomes king, 2 Chronicles 14, verse 1 and 2. He makes reforms, 2 Chronicles 14, verses 3 through 7. He wars with Ethiopia. Now, we don't read about this war with Ethiopia over in 1 Kings. Now, Mark just asked a minute ago, when he's warring against Baasha, why couldn't he have stood up and, made a rousing speech? He doesn't, but he does, Mark, pray to God, and it looks like, No wonder Asa's a good king. If we look back at the charts, there's a smiley face next to Asa. He's a good king. And you want to see how he places his trust in God. Look at chapters 14, verses 9 through 15. This is 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 9 through 15. Somebody go ahead and read that. 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 9 through 15. Very good. Thank you very much. So look at verse 11. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one besides you to help in battle between the powerful and those who have no strength. So please help us, O Lord, our God. So I read this, Mark, and I do think about, well, Asa might have been there for his dad's speech. I mean, he's going to God in prayer and asking for God's help. He's trusting in God. But it's interesting that we don't get this story in 1 Kings. Kind of like Ryan alluded to earlier, if somebody did something right, Chronicles is going to mention it in the Kings of Judah. And this is right. He trusted in God. So what happens when he goes to war with King Baasha, which we were reading about in 1 Kings a minute ago? How does he lose that faith? And here in Chronicles, there's going to be a prophet that calls him out for it. There's going to be somebody who comes to him and say, how come you didn't trust God again? And he lacked in faith. We're going to have to stop there. It's 9:44, and I got a lot more to say. So we'll continue with our study of Asa next week. Lots of great comments today. Thank you very much.